The wind was her only constant companion, a sculptor of the dust that coated everything she owned. For 20 years, it had scoured the high plains, carving canyons into the earth and solitude into her soul. Ilara's cabin, hunkered low against a granite bluff, was a testament to endurance. Its timbers, silvered by sun and sand, were her own bones, and the single glass pane of its window was her one clear eye on a world she had long ago forsaken. The world within was one of ritual, the stoking of the fire, the grinding of corn, the mending of clothes that had no one left to see them. It was a life whittled down to the bare essentials of survival, a penance she paid for a memory she could not bury deep enough. The silence was a presence in itself, so profound that the scuttling of a mouse in the walls was an event, the cry of a hawk a conversation. This silence was her shield. It was her peace. It was her prison. The day the world returned, it did not ride in on a storm or a cloud of dust. It arrived as a sound she had not heard in 2 decades, a faint, desperate knocking on her door. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred quiet she had cultivated. Her first instinct was animalistic, to freeze, to become one with the shadows. Who would come to this forsaken place? No one knew she was here. No one living, at least. She moved from the hearth, her hand closing not on a weapon, but on the worn handle of a cast-iron skillet, its weight familiar and solid. She peered through a small crack in the timber wall. What she saw was not the hardened face of a prospector or the hollow eyes of a drifter. She saw children. 3 of them, huddled together like a trio of sparrows fallen from a nest. The oldest, a boy of maybe 10, stood with his small shoulders squared, one arm protectively around a girl, whose face was a mask of tear-streaked dirt. Clinging to the boy's other leg was the smallest, a little boy who looked at the door with an awful, vacant stare. They were bones and rags, their feet bare and bleeding. The oldest boy raised a fist and knocked again, a gesture that seemed to cost him the last of his strength. Ilara's heart, a thing she thought had turned to stone, gave a painful, unfamiliar lurch. Every instinct screamed at her to remain silent, to wait until they gave up and moved on, swallowed by the wilderness that had so nearly swallowed her. They were not her burden. She had earned her isolation. She had paid for it in blood and grief. But then the girl let out a small, wretched sob, a sound that slipped through the cracks in the door and pierced the armor around Ilara's heart. It was the sound of utter hopelessness. She looked at their small, fragile forms silhouetted against the unforgiving expanse of the plains, and she saw ghosts. Not just their ghosts, but her own. The latch on the door felt impossibly heavy in her hand. She pulled the heavy bar back. The groan of the wood was a sound of surrender. The children flinched at the noise, stumbling back a step. Ilara stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light of her cabin, the skillet still held tight in her hand. For a long moment, they only stared. She saw their fear, raw and immediate. They saw a woman made of the same hard, weathered material as the landscape behind her, her face a map of sorrows they were too young to read. Her voice, when it came, was rough with disuse, a gravelly sound that startled even herself. "What do you want?" The boy, Samuel, swallowed hard, his throat clicking with dryness. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Shelter. Just for the night. Our folks." He couldn't finish. He didn't have to. Ilara had seen the aftermath of raids before, long ago. The splintered wagons, the unnatural silence. She wanted to say no. The word was there, a stone in her throat. Saying yes meant letting the world back in. It meant food from her meager stores, water from her precious well, space in a life that had room for only one. It meant an end to the long, quiet penance that had become her identity. But the little one, Finn, began to cough, a dry, hacking sound that shook his entire frame, and the girl, Leah, huddled closer to her brother, her eyes fixed on Ilara with a silent, desperate plea. It was a plea that asked for nothing more than a moment's safety in a world that had offered them none. The wind picked up, whipping dust into their faces, and Ilara knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical blow, that to turn them away was to sentence them to death. It was a choice she could not make. Not again. She stepped back from the door, a silent invitation. In, she rasped. "Get in," and they scurried past her like frightened mice, their small bodies radiating a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. As she barred the door behind them, the cabin, once her sanctuary of solitude, felt impossibly, terrifyingly crowded. The silence was not just broken, it was shattered, and its loss echoed louder than any sound. The first days were a negotiation of silences. The children were ghosts in her house, moving with a spectral quietness born of terror. They ate the broth she made them without a word, their eyes darting around the small, dark space as if expecting a blow to fall at any moment. Ilara found their presence abrasive, an irritant under her skin. She had forgotten the sheer noise of other people breathing, the space their bodies took up, the faint smells of dust and sorrow they carried with them. Her carefully constructed routines were fractured. 3 more mouths to feed meant her winter stores, already lean, were now perilously thin. Every scoop of cornmeal, every ladle of water, felt like a piece of her own future being given away. She felt a resentful anger rise in her, sharp and unwelcome. They were a weight, a responsibility she had never asked for. She watched them from her corner by the hearth, her posture rigid. Samuel, the oldest, tried to make himself useful. He followed her out to the woodpile, his small hands struggling to lift pieces of wood half his size. He never asked for thanks, merely stacking them with a grim determination that was unnerving in a child. Leah, quieter still, found a loose thread on Ilara's sleeve one afternoon and, with hesitant fingers, tucked it back into the seam. A small, intimate gesture that made Ilara flinch away as if she'd been burned. The youngest, Finn, was the most unnerving. He rarely spoke, but would sit in the dirt by the door, drawing shapes with a stick, circles and lines that meant nothing to Ilara until she realized he was drawing a wagon over and over again. A wagon with one wheel broken. Ilara felt the weight of their unspoken story pressing down on her, suffocating her. This was not her grief to carry. She had her own, a vast and barren landscape she had wandered for 2 decades. There was no room for anyone else's. Yet, she could not cast them out. Each morning she rose and made the fire, and each morning 3 sets of eyes watched her, their existence a constant, silent question. What now? What of us? It was a question she had no answer for. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the house began to change. The silence shifted from a tense, fearful thing to something softer, more lived in. It became punctuated by the small sounds of life returning. The whisper of Leah helping to sweep the floor with a handmade broom, the thud of Samuel dropping wood into the box by the fire, the soft, humming sound Finn would make as he traced his circles in the dust. Ilara observed it all from a distance she tried to maintain, a fortress wall she kept rebuilding around her heart. But the children were like persistent vines, finding cracks in the mortar. One evening, a sudden chill descended from the mountains. Ilara was stirring a thin stew over the fire when she saw Leah shivering, her arms wrapped around herself. Without thinking, Ilara took the worn wool shawl from her own shoulders, the one she'd had for 30 years, and draped it over the girl. Leah looked up, her wide, dark eyes filled with a startled sort of wonder. She didn't say thank you. She simply leaned into the rough warmth of the wool, a silent acceptance that was more powerful than any word. Ilara turned back to the fire, her hands trembling slightly. The gesture had been automatic, a forgotten instinct rising from a deep, buried well of motherhood. A few nights later, she was awakened by a muffled cry. It was Finn, thrashing in his sleep, caught in the grips of a nightmare. Before Ilara could move, Samuel was there, kneeling beside his brother, whispering to him in a low, steady voice. "It's all right, Finn. We're safe now." "I'm here." Ilara lay in her cot in the darkness, listening. The boy's voice was filled with a fierce, parental love that belied his age. He was trying to be their father, their mother, their protector. He was trying to hold their shattered world together with his own small hands. A strange, painful pressure built in her chest. For 20 years, she had believed strength was solitude. It was pushing the world away, bearing her pain alone. But watching these children, watching them cling to each other, she saw a different kind of strength, one forged in connection, in the desperate, beautiful act of caring for one another. That night, she hummed a lullaby under her breath, a melody she thought she had long forgotten. The tune was fragile in the quiet cabin, a ghost of a sound from another life, but for the first time in a very long time, it did not feel like a lament. The land itself sent the first warning. Ilara was checking her snares by the creek, a task she had done 1,000 times, when she saw it. A single footprint, pressed deep into the damp earth near the water's edge. It was not hers. It was not a child's. It was the mark of a moccasin, clear and defined, and it sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had not seen such a track in years. The tribes kept to the high mountains or the distant southern deserts, their territories well established and far from her valley. This was an anomaly. A disruption. She quickly erased the print with the side of her boot, her eye scanning the silent, empty ridges that surrounded her homestead. The world suddenly felt sharp and dangerous again, the familiar landscape imbued with a hidden menace. A few days later, the second sign appeared. Perched on the top post of her small corral was a single eagle feather, its base tied with a strand of red-dyed sinew. It hadn't been there when she'd let the mule out that morning. It was not a threat, not in the way a broken arrow might be. It was a message. It said, "We see you. We are here." Fear, cold and familiar, became her shadow once more. It was not just for herself now. The weight of it was tripled, quadrupled. She looked at the children that evening as they ate, their faces illuminated by the firelight. They were just beginning to lose the haunted look in their eyes. Leah had laughed for the first time that afternoon, a small, bright sound like a wind chime. Finn had finally stopped drawing the broken wagon. That fragile piece was now threatened by a danger they could not possibly understand. A new kind of resolve hardened within Ilara. Her solitude had been a retreat, this was a defense. That afternoon, she took the children to the root cellar. "If you ever hear me call out a hawk's cry, one single cry, you come here," she told them, her voice low and urgent. "You do not make a sound. You do not move. You become stones. Do you understand?" They nodded, their eyes wide with a renewed fear that she hated herself for putting there. She taught Samuel how to brace the cellar door from the inside. She taught Leah how to muffle a cough, how to breathe silently. She was teaching them the art of her own lonely survival, the art of becoming invisible. They came with the dawn. There was no war cry, no thundering of hooves that shook the earth. It was a far more terrifying arrival. It was a silent, inexorable flood. Ilara was at the window, watching the grey light seep over the eastern ridge, when she saw the first one. A rider, silhouetted against the nascent sun. Then another. And another. Within minutes, the entire rim of her valley was lined with them. They did not advance. They simply appeared, a great, silent host that filled the horizon. 500, she guessed, maybe more. Warriors on horseback, families with travois, elders and children. An entire people on the move. They were Apaches, their lean, hard forms unmistakable. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. This was not a raiding party. This was a migration. Her small homestead, her well, her meager patch of land, sat directly in their path. "Hawk's cry," she whispered, her voice tight with dread. The children's eyes went wide. Without a word, they scrambled down into the darkness of the root cellar, pulling the heavy plank door shut behind them. The click of the bar locking into place was deafeningly loud in the sudden, absolute silence of the cabin. Ilara was alone again, but this was a different kind of solitude. It was the solitude of the besieged. She took her rifle from its pegs above the mantel. The steel was cold and heavy, an old and terrible friend. She checked the load, her hand steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. From the window, she watched as the sea of people began to flow down from the ridges, slowly, deliberately, filling the valley floor. They moved with a purpose that was both beautiful and terrifying. They set up camp with practiced efficiency, their lodges of hide and bent poles rising from the scrubland like organic growths. They were not attacking. They were simply occupying. Her cabin was now an island, a solitary stone in the midst of a great, flowing river of humanity. The sheer, overwhelming presence of them was an act of intimidation more potent than any weapon. They surrounded her, yet they ignored her. It was a profound and terrifying statement of power. She was insignificant. Her claim to this land, her 20 years of sweat and solitude, meant nothing. They had rendered her invisible. A single rider detached himself from the sprawling camp. He did not charge her cabin, nor did he make any threatening gesture. He rode at a steady, unhurried pace to a low hillock about 200 yards from her door, a place that offered a clear, unobstructed view of the cabin, the well, and the small, fenced garden. He was a man who radiated authority. Even from a distance, Ilara could see the confidence in his posture, the way he sat his horse as if he were part of it. He wore no elaborate war bonnet, only a simple leather band across his brow. He was the leader. It was an instinctual certainty. He dismounted, and for a long time, he simply stood, his arms crossed, watching her cabin. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the valley. Flies buzzed against her window pane. The world held its breath. Ilara remained at the window, her rifle resting on the sill. She did not raise it. She did not hide. She understood this was a test, a battle of wills being fought across a silent expanse of dust and sunlight. It was not a prelude to an attack. It was an assessment. He was measuring her, trying to understand the nature of the creature that lived in this stone and timber shell. Hours crawled by. The man on the hill did not move. He was as patient and still as the granite bluffs behind him. Ilara's muscles ached from the tension. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve was a harder, colder thing. She would not show weakness. She would not be intimidated into fleeing. This cabin was the last bastion of her life, the only thing she had left. She had defended it from drought, from blizzards, from the crushing weight of her own memories. She would defend it now. The siege was not of her walls, but of her spirit. He was waiting for her to break. She met his silent, relentless gaze with her own, pouring all of her stubborn, hard-won resilience into that single act of defiance. The sun began its slow descent towards the western ridges, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley. Still, he watched. The afternoon wind, a harbinger of evening, began to rise. It was a restless, probing force, and it swirled through the yard with a sudden, violent gust. It tore at the small, weathered cross that stood over the mound of stones behind the cabin. The simple grave marker, the only physical evidence of the grief that had driven her into this exile, tilted, loosened by the wind's assault. Ilara saw it from the window, and a raw, protective instinct surged through her, overriding all fear, all strategy. That was her ground. Her sorrow. Her child. Heedless of the hundreds of eyes that might be on her, she unbarred the door and ran out into the open. The wind whipped her hair across her face and tore at her dress. She fell to her knees beside the small grave, her hands pushing the dry, cracked earth back into place, tamping it down, securing the wooden cross that bore no name. She clutched it for a moment, her shoulders shaking with a tremor that was not from the cold. It was a moment of pure, unshielded vulnerability, an act she had not allowed anyone to witness for 20 years. From his vantage point on the hill, the Apache leader, Kayana, saw everything. He saw not an enemy settler in a fortress, but a woman kneeling at a child's grave. He saw the small, meticulously tended garden struggling for life in the harsh soil. He saw the neatly patched roof, the clean-swept yard. He saw the signs not of a conqueror, but of a survivor. A person who grieved and who endured, just as his own people did. He saw a kindred spirit in a different skin. The next morning, Ilara woke to find the valley floor bustling with the quiet activity of the camp. As she scanned the perimeter, her gaze fell upon a flat rock near her fence line, a rock that had been bare the night before. Resting upon it was a small parcel wrapped in leaves. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It could be a trick, a threat. But her instincts told her otherwise. Cautiously, with her rifle held loosely in one hand, she approached it. Inside the leaves was a strip of dried venison and a handful of roasted piñon nuts. It was not a threat. It was an offering. A gesture. A recognition. It was a word spoken across a silent battlefield, a word that said, "I see your strength. I see your sorrow. You are not my enemy." She took the food back inside, her mind reeling. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by something far more complex and uncertain. The world was no longer black and white, aggressor and victim. It had become 1,000 shades of grey. The new danger announced itself with noise. Not the quiet purpose of the Apache camp, but the loud, arrogant shouts of men who believed the world belonged to them. For riders appeared from the northern pass, trailing a pair of heavily laden mules. They were white men, prospectors or ex-soldiers by their rough look, their faces bristly with greed. They laughed too loudly, their voices carrying on the still air, a profane intrusion into the valley's tense truce. Hidden in the cellar, Samuel peered through a thin crack between the floorboards. A sharp, strangled gasp escaped his lips. Elara, hearing it, knew instantly. These were the men. The men who had left them orphans. The bandits reined in their horses, their eyes sweeping over the scene. They saw a lone cabin, a single woman, and a vast, empty-looking Apache camp. They mistook the quiet for weakness, the lack of overt defense for fear. "Look at that, boys," one of them sneered, his voice carrying clearly to the cabin. "Squatters and Injuns. Whole valleys ripe for the picking." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We'll start with the house." They saw an easy target. They saw a woman to be terrorized, a home to be plundered, and a native camp to be provoked or ignored as they saw fit. They saw what their greed wanted them to see. They did not see the hundreds of pairs of eyes watching them from the cover of the ridges and the concealment of the lodges. They did not see the silent warriors melting into the landscape, bows in hand. They did not see Quana, standing now by his horse, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He watched the white men dismount, watched them draw their pistols with casual menace. He watched them advance on the cabin of the woman who tended her child's grave. And he made his choice. This intrusion, this casual cruelty, was a sickness he recognized. It was the same sickness that had driven his own people from their lands. The men took 2 more steps towards her door, raising their weapons. The valley held its breath. The first gunshot was a shattering violation of the morning. It wasn't from an Apache bow, but from a bandit's pistol, a wild shot meant to frighten, to terrorize. It smashed through Elara's single window, showering the floor with glittering shards of glass. Her one eye on the world was broken. A cold, clear rage settled over her. They had not just attacked her home, they had attacked her children's last sanctuary. She raised her own rifle to the shattered frame and fired. The heavy report echoed her fury, and one of the men yelled, clutching his arm as he staggered back. But she was one. They were 4. They spread out, using her own woodpile and corral for cover, beginning a concerted assault. "Drag the witch out," one of them yelled. Just as he stepped from behind the corral, a soundless blur of motion cut through the air. An arrow, fletched in hawk feathers, took him high in the chest, sinking deep. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. A stunned silence fell over the other 3 bandits. Before they could react, the world erupted. From the ridges, from the scrub, from behind rocks she never knew could hide a man, the Apache warriors rose. It was not a chaotic charge. It was a coordinated, terrifyingly silent descent. They flowed down into the yard like a river of vengeance. There was no shouting, only the soft thud of moccasins on dirt, the hum of bowstrings, and the wet, final sound of arrows finding their mark. It was not a battle, it was a reaping. Elara, still at the window, watched in stunned awe. In the midst of the swift, deadly chaos, she saw one of the last remaining bandits raise his pistol. He wasn't aiming at the wave of warriors, but at the lone figure of their leader, Quana, who was directing the attack with sharp, precise hand signals, his attention focused on his men. The bandit had a clear shot. Time seemed to slow. There was no room for thought, only for the same instinct that had sent her to the grave marker. She shifted the rifle, found the man in her sights, and squeezed the trigger. Her bullet struck him a fraction of a second before he could fire his own. He fell. The sudden, absolute silence that followed was more profound than any that had come before. The last of the bandits was gone. The yard was still. The Apache warriors stood silent, their faces grim. Kaina turned his head, his dark eyes finding Elara in the broken window of her cabin. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement. A debt recognized. A bond forged in the crucible of violence. The dust began to settle, mingling with the thin wisps of smoke from the spent cartridges. The Apache warriors moved with quiet efficiency, retrieving their arrows, their faces impassive. There was no celebration, only the somber completion of a necessary task. Elara slowly lowered her rifle, its barrel still warm. She watched as Kaina walked towards her cabin. He did not come all the way to the door. He stopped at a respectful distance, near the flat rock where he had left the offering of food. He stood, waiting. Elara pushed the door open and stepped out into the sunlight. The smell of gunpowder hung sharp in the air. She did not look at the still forms in the yard, she looked only at him. They stood for a long moment, two solitary figures from different worlds, bound by an unexpected and unspoken alliance. No words were necessary. His eyes held a deep, profound respect. He had seen her fierce, maternal defense, and she had seen his decisive, protective leadership. In that shared gaze, 20 years of Elara's self-imposed exile crumbled. She was not just a grieving hermit, she was a protector, a survivor, a woman of strength who had faced down the world and not flinched. Kaina raised a single, open hand, a gesture of peace, of farewell, of honor. Elara mirrored the gesture, her own hand steady. He turned without another look and swung up onto his horse. With a silent command, he led his people away. They packed their camp as silently as they had made it, melting back into the landscape, a river flowing on its course. By midday, the valley was empty again, as if they had never been. The only signs of their passage were the fading tracks in the dust and the profound silence they left behind. Elara went to the root cellar and slid back the heavy door. 3 small, terrified faces looked up at her from the darkness. "It's over," she said, her voice softer than they had ever heard it. "You're safe." She led them out into the light, and for the first time, she did not see them as intruders. She saw them as hers. She looked at her small, damaged cabin, the broken window like a wound. But it was no longer a prison of her grief. It was a home. A fortress that had been tested by fear and consecrated by courage. She had faced down the ghosts of her past and the dangers of the present, and in doing so, had found not just the will to survive, but a reason to live. The wind still whispered across the plains, but it no longer sounded of loneliness. It sounded of a promise. She was not alone anymore. She was a mother. And they were a family.